Imagine you're walking through the streets of ancient Athens in 420 BC, marveling at the magnificent marble columns of the Parthenon gleaming against the azure Mediterranean sky. The air is filled with the sounds of intellectual discourse, as philosophers debate the nature of virtue in the Agora, while merchants hawk their exotic wares from distant lands. Citizens dressed in flowing white chittons move with dignity through the bustling marketplace, their voices carrying animated discussions about democracy, art, and the pursuit of human excellence. This is the Athens we learned about in school, the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western philosophy, the shining beacon of civilization that gave us Socrates, Plato, and the very concept of rational thought. But as you wander deeper into the wealthy districts, past the gleaming temples and public buildings, you begin to notice something the textbooks never mentioned. Behind those pristine marble facades, in the shadowed courtyards of elaborate mansions, exists a world that would shatter every romanticized notion you've ever held about the glory of ancient Greece. In those hidden chambers, where the light of civilization rarely penetrates, young men move with downcast eyes and careful steps. Their bodies bear marks that speak of suffering beyond comprehension, their spirits crushed under the weight of a system so brutal that it transforms human beings into living objects designed solely for the pleasure of their masters. These are the male concubines of ancient Greece, and their stories have been deliberately erased from the historical record by those who found them inconvenient to remember. We're going to peel back the sanitized veneer of classical antiquity and examine the real cost of Athenian prosperity. We follow the journey of a young boy whose life was forever altered by the economics of desperation, whose childhood ended the moment he became currency in a transaction he never understood. His story isn't unique. It's representative of thousands upon thousands of forgotten victims whose suffering built the foundation upon which Western civilization claims to stand. The boy we call Alexios was born in a small farming village nestled between olive groves in the hills outside Athens. His world was simple but harsh. Families lived in single-room mud brick houses with dirt floors, sharing their cramped spaces with goats and chickens. Children ran barefoot through narrow lanes, their laughter mixing with the bleating of livestock and the rhythmic sound of women grinding grain with stone mortar. Life was difficult, but it was life nonetheless, governed by the eternal cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death, joy and sorrow that had sustained rural communities for generations. Alexios was 12 when the drought came. Week after week, the merciless sun beat down on withering crops, while clouds gathered tantalizingly on the horizon, only to dissipate without releasing their precious cargo. The olive trees, ancient guardians of the hillsides, produced only shriveled fruit that crumbled to dust in desperate hands. Wells that had sustained the village for generations began to run dry, their stone-lined depths revealing cracked earth where life-giving water once flowed. As the crisis deepened, families faced choices that no parents should ever have to make. First came the livestock, sold for whatever pittance buyers would offer. Then the jewelry, those few precious items passed down through generations, traded away for enough grain to last another week. But when the last silver bracelet had been bartered and the final goat led away, families began looking at their children with different eyes. The slave merchants arrived like carrion birds, sensing opportunity. They established their grim marketplace in the village center, air chains and ropes coiled like metal serpents, their ledgers filled with names and prices that reduced human beings to mathematical equations. They offered immediate payment for long-term contracts, 20 years of service for enough silver to keep a family fed through the winter. When your children are literally starving, when their hollow eyes plead silently for food you cannot provide, when their thin bodies grow weaker each day, such arrangements can seem like salvation rather than damnation. Alexios stood beside his father as the transaction was negotiated, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing the gravity of the moment. The merchant examined him with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what different types of buyers sought. He checked the boy's teeth like a horse trader, tested the strength of his young muscles, evaluated his features with cold calculation. The words he used, promising and suitable for household service, meant nothing to a 12-year-old who had never ventured beyond his village boundaries. The silver coins caught the sunlight as they were counted into his father's trembling palm, each piece representing a year of the boy's life. His mother turned away, unable to watch the final moments of the transaction, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They'd promised Alexios it was temporary, that he would earn money and return home as a wealthy man, perhaps even wealthy enough to buy land of his own. The lies fell from their lips like honey from a broken comb, sweet but ultimately poisonous. The journey to Athens was a nightmare of iron chains and blistered feet. Alexios found himself part of a human caravan, dozens of boys and young men linked together by metal bonds and shared despair. The older captives maintained their silence, having learned that hope was merely another word for future disappointment. The younger ones cried for their mothers until their voices gave out, or until the overseers beat the sound from their throats with casual efficiency. They marched through landscapes that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Rolling hills covered in silver-green olive groves stretched toward distant mountains, while coastal roads offered glimpses of the sea, sparkling like scattered diamonds in the Mediterranean sun. But Alexios saw none of this beauty. His world had shrunk to the length of chain between himself and the boy ahead of him, to the rhythm of feet on stone, and to the growing certainty that he would never see his family again. At night, they were chained to stakes driven deep into the earth. Lying on his side in the dirt, listening to the muffled sobs of other captives, Alexios tried to make sense of what was happening to him. Sometimes, well-dressed men would visit the caravan, walking among the chained boys like farmers examining livestock. They would prod and poke, checking for signs of disease or injury, evaluating potential for various forms of service with detached professionalism. These inspections taught Alexios to recognize different types of buyers, though he didn't yet understand the full implications of these distinctions. Agricultural purchasers looked for muscle and endurance, seeking boys who could work in fields from sunrise to sunset. Household masters evaluated intelligence and compliance, wanting servants who could be trained for domestic duties without causing trouble. But there was a third category of buyer, and even in his innocence, Alexios learned to dread their visits most of all. These men dressed in expensive silk tunics, spoke with cultured accents, and wore rings that glittered with precious stones. When they examined the merchandise, their touches lingered in ways that made young skin crawl with inexplicable revulsion. They were searching for something specific, a combination of youth and beauty that had nothing to do with labor capacity and everything to do with darker appetites that thrived in the shadows of civilized society. The slave market in Athens was an assault on every human sense and sensibility. The cacophony of hundreds of voices haggling over human flesh created a din that seemed to mock the very concept of civilization. The sounds that rose from that marketplace defied every principle of human dignity. Naked bodies were arranged in orderly rows, like pottery displayed for sale. Children barely old enough to understand speech standing beside their weeping mothers. Elderly men with broken backs, whose value was measured only in whatever strength remained in their failing muscles. The buyers circulated through this human warehouse with the casual indifference of shoppers selecting fruit, pointing and discussing prices as if the trembling figures before them possessed no capacity for suffering or shame. Alexios was scrubbed and oiled before his auction, not from any consideration for his comfort, but because clean merchandise commanded higher prices. The olive oil made his young skin gleam in the harsh sunlight, highlighting the lean muscles he had developed during the grueling march to the city. Someone had decided he was too aesthetically pleasing for fieldwork and positioned him among the household slaves, those destined for indoor service in the mansions of the wealthy. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the marketplace as he cataloged Alexius's attributes like a merchant describing a bolt of fine cloth. His age, his region of origin, his unblemished condition, all were proclaimed to the gathering crowd of potential buyers. The man made particular mention of his pleasing features and docile temperament, code words that caused certain bidders to lean forward with predatory interest. The competition for Alexios was fierce, driving his price steadily upward as multiple buyers recognized his potential value. He stood frozen on the wooden platform, desperately trying to disappear into himself, as strange hands examined his body with clinical detachment. Someone forced his mouth open to inspect his teeth. Another tested his reflexes. A third ran calculating fingers through his dark hair, while commenting on its texture and quality to his companions. The winning bidder was a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air around him. Lysander was perhaps 40 years old, well-fed and soft-handed, with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never known physical hardship. His expensive purple tunic proclaimed wealth and status, while his eyes held a cold satisfaction as he counted out the silver that would make Alexios his property. Even before the transaction was complete, that gaze already possessed the boy completely. Lysander's mansion occupied an entire city block in the most exclusive district of Athens. Its marble columns rivaled those of public temples, while elaborate frescoes depicted gods and heroes in scenes of mythological grandeur. Servants moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their movements quick and nervous, betraying an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the entire household. Alexios noticed that many of these servants were young men of exceptional beauty, all bearing the same expression of resigned despair that he was beginning to recognize as the face of captivity. The overseer who claimed custody of Alexios from his new master was a man named Demetrius, himself a former slave who had risen through a combination of intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. He understood better than anyone how to break spirits and ensure absolute compliance, having once occupied the same position as the terrified boys he now controlled. As he led Alexios through the opulent halls, he explained the rules that would govern every aspect of his new existence. Food would be provided twice daily, barley porridge at dawn and bread with olives at sunset. Clean clothing would be issued weekly. Bathing would occur when ordered, and sleep would be permitted only in designated areas at approved times. Most importantly, Demetrius emphasized with a cruel smile, Alexios would serve the master and his guests in whatever capacity they required, and the nature of this service would become clear through experience rather than explanation. The sleeping quarters for male slaves occupied the basement level of the mansion, a series of small stone cells that had clearly been designed to contain rather than comfort their occupants. Each cell held a straw mattress, a thin woolen blanket, and a clay chamber pot. The walls were thick enough to muffle sound, a feature whose purpose Alexios would understand all too soon. His fellow slaves greeted him with a mixture of sympathy and warning. There was Marcus, barely older than Alexios himself, who had survived 2 years in the household through a combination of strategic compliance and psychological withdrawal. His eyes held depths of pain that seemed impossible for someone so young, speaking to experiences that had aged his soul far beyond his physical years. Then there was Philemon, a boy of 14 whose merchant family had fallen into debt, leading to his sale along with his younger brother, who had not survived his first winter in captivity. These broken young men explained the household as true purpose during whispered conversations in the darkness of their cells. While Athens celebrated the symposium as the pinnacle of intellectual achievement, gatherings where the greatest minds of their age discussed philosophy, politics, and the nature of virtue itself. The reality behind closed doors was far different from the sanitized version that would be passed down through history. The slaves were expected to serve these learned men not just food and wine, but themselves. The philosophers who debated the nature of justice by day showed no hesitation in exploiting helpless boys by night. The politicians who spoke eloquently about the rights of citizens felt no contradiction in treating human property as living toys to be used and discarded at will. The contradiction wasn't accidental or born of ignorance. It was structural, built into the very foundation of a society that defined virtue and justice as concepts that applied only to free citizens, while everyone else existed beyond the reach of moral consideration. Philemon described the preparation rituals with a voice that had been stripped of all emotion, as if he were recounting someone else's nightmare rather than his own lived experience. The slaves would be bathed and oiled until their skin gleamed like polished marble. They would be dressed in tunics of the finest linen, so sheer and clinging that they served more to entice than to clothe. Sometimes jewelry would be added, golden bracelets or necklaces that marked them as ornamental rather than utilitarian, beautiful objects designed to enhance the aesthetic pleasure of their viewers. The symposiums began formally enough, with guests reclining on elaborate couches arranged around the central room. The conversation would start with elevated topics, discussions of Socratic philosophy, or the latest political developments in the broader Greek world. These were genuinely educated men who took pride in their intellectual sophistication, their ability to engage with complex ideas and abstract concepts that lesser minds could not grasp. But as wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, the tone would inevitably shift. Philosophical discourse gave way to cruder entertainment. Elevated discussions devolved into boastful competition, and the slaves who had been serving quietly at the edges of the room suddenly found themselves the center of unwanted attention. It would begin with seemingly innocent requests. Pour wine for this guest. Massage the shoulders of that one. Feed grapes to the man reclining in the corner. Each task appeared harmless in isolation, but Alexios quickly learned to read the warning signs that preceded disaster. The way conversations would quiet when he approached certain guests, the lingering touches that had nothing to do with serving wine, the predatory gazes that followed his movements around the room with hungry intensity. The other slaves had developed their own silent language of warnings, subtle gestures and meaningful glances that could alert a newcomer to immediate danger without attracting the attention of their masters. The first time, Alexios was selected for special service. His innocence protected him from understanding what was truly happening until it was far too late to resist. An elderly guest, a man old enough to be his grandfather, requested that the boy join him on his couch to share wine and conversation. The invitation seemed almost kindly, an older man taking interest in a young person's background and experiences. The questions began innocuously enough, inquiries about his homeland and family, expressions of sympathy for his current circumstances. But as the man's wine-heavy breath grew closer and his hands began to wander from shoulder to back to places that made Alexios instinctively try to pull away, the true nature of the situation became horrifyingly clear. His attempts to withdraw were met with tightening grips and amused laughter from other guests, who had paused their own conversations to observe the evening's entertainment. What followed was seared into Alexius's memory with the terrible clarity that only trauma can provide. The way his desperate protests were ignored, as if he had not spoken at all, how his struggles were received as amusing, rather than heartbreaking, the feeling of complete helplessness, as multiple hands held him down while his childhood was torn away in the most brutal manner imaginable. The other guests continued their philosophical discussions, even as the assault unfolded before them, occasionally glancing over to offer commentary or suggestions as if they were watching a theatrical performance rather than the destruction of a human soul. Afterwards, as Alexios lay trembling in his stone cell, staring at the ceiling, while his body throbbed with pain he had never imagined possible, he tried to comprehend how the world could contain such casual cruelty. The men who had just violated him were the same ones who spent hours debating the nature of human excellence and the proper ordering of society. They wrote poetry about beauty and love while turning children into instruments of their darkest desires. This was only the beginning of his education in the true nature of Athenian civilization. Over the following months, Alexios discovered that what had happened on that first terrible night was considered mild entertainment by the standards of Lysander and his household. Some guests arrived with specific preferences, particular cruelties they wished to inflict. Others competed among themselves to see who could devise the most creative degradations, treating the breaking of young spirits as a form of artistic expression. The household operated on a carefully maintained hierarchy of suffering. The newest arrivals bore the worst treatment, serving as fresh victims for the guests' appetites, while older slaves graduated to different forms of service. But advancement in this twisted system required more than mere survival. It demanded the complete surrender of human dignity, a willingness to participate actively in one's own dehumanization. Alexios watched other boys attempt different forms of resistance, each met with escalating punishments designed to serve as examples. Marcus had tried to escape during his second month, only to be dragged back and beaten so severely that he still walked with a pronounced limp. Another boy named Theron had refused a particularly degrading command and spent a week chained naked in the courtyard, exposed to the elements while guests used his suffering as dinner entertainment. The psychological techniques employed to break these young spirits were as sophisticated as they were cruel. Complete isolation from everything familiar stripped away identity and hope. Unpredictability created a constant state of terror that wore down resistance more effectively than any physical torture. The boys never knew when they would be summoned, what would be demanded of them, or how severe the punishment might be for the smallest perceived transgression. Perhaps most insidiously, the masters systematically destroyed every connection to their slaves' former lives. Names were changed to something more pleasing to Greek ears. Native languages were forbidden. Family customs were replaced with household rituals that reinforced their status as property. Slowly and methodically, everything that had once defined these young people as individuals was stripped away and replaced with the hollow compliance of broken objects. The guests who frequented Lysander's symposiums represented the pinnacle of Athenian society. There was Dionysios, a respected politician whose public speeches championed justice and civic virtue, but who privately delighted in forcing young slaves to perform increasingly degrading acts while he quoted passages from Homer. Cleomenes, a wealthy merchant celebrated for his charitable donations to public works, revealed appetites for violence that left permanent scars on his victims' bodies and souls. Most disturbing was Sophistes, a renowned philosopher whose treatises on ethics were studied throughout the Greek world. His public teachings emphasized virtue, self-control, and respect for the divine order, but wine and darkness transformed him into something monstrous. He would justify every cruelty with elaborate philosophical arguments, claiming that pain taught valuable lessons about the natural hierarchy of existence. These men saw no contradiction between their public personas and private behaviors. In their minds, slaves existed in a completely different moral category than free citizens. The virtues that governed relationships between equals simply did not apply to property. This moral blindness extended throughout Greek society, allowing the same culture that produced magnificent art and groundbreaking philosophy to normalize the complete dehumanization of entire classes of people. As months turned to years, Alexios developed survival strategies that would have been unimaginable to his younger self. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a guest's mood and preferences, discovering which behaviors might earn small rewards and which would result in savage punishment. He mastered the art of psychological absence, appearing compliant while retreating so deeply into himself that his essential spirit remained untouchable. But survival came at a terrible cost. Each compromise with evil chipped away at something fundamental inside him. Each moment of submission reinforced the lesson that he was powerless, worthless, disposable. The boy who had once run laughing through olive groves became a hollow-eyed young man who moved through life like a ghost haunting his own body. The other slaves became his only family, bound together by shared trauma and desperate mutual protection. They developed silent languages of warning and comfort, ways to communicate danger and offer solace without alerting their captors. They shared what little food they could spare, took turns standing watch during brief rest periods, and held each other when nightmares became too overwhelming to bear alone. Yet even these bonds were corrupted by the system that created them. Competition for the master's favor could turn friends into enemies overnight. The promise of slightly better treatment might tempt someone to betray a planned escape or report another slave's minor transgression. The very relationships that preserved sanity also became tools of oppression. Years passed in this nightmare of systematic dehumanization. Alexios watched his reflection change from a frightened child to a broken young man whose eyes held depths of pain that mirrored those he had first seen in Marcus. New boys arrived regularly to replace those who died or were sold away, creating an endless cycle of fresh victims for the household's appetites. Some nights, lying on his straw mattress in the stone darkness, Alexios tried to remember his mother's face, but the image grew fainter with each passing month. His father's voice became a distant echo, drowned out by the laughter of guests and the cries of fellow slaves. His past transformed into something dreamlike and insubstantial, while his present nightmare stretched endlessly toward an unimaginable future. By his 18th year, changes in his body and bearing marked him as too old for his master's preferences. New slaves arrived with fresh beauty and unbroken spirits, making his practiced compliance seem ordinary rather than exotic. He was becoming invisible in a different way, overlooked rather than coveted, discarded like a toy that had lost its appeal. The end, when it came, arrived without ceremony or drama. Demetrius informed him that he was being sold to a mining operation in the mountains, presented as neither punishment nor reward, but simply an economic decision. His value as entertainment had depreciated below the cost of maintenance, but he still possessed years of hard labor that could generate profit for his owners. Everyone knew what the mines meant. They were where slaves went to die slowly, their lungs destroyed by stone dust, their bodies broken by impossible quotas and collapsing tunnels. Life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. It wasn't execution exactly, but it wasn't survival either. Alexios received this news with the same emotional numbness that had characterized his existence for years. Death in the mines or death in the household. What difference did it make? He had been dead in every meaningful sense for so long that the cessation of biological function seemed almost redundant. As he prepared for transport, Marcus approached during his final night in the familiar cell. Somehow, the other boy had managed to survive and even achieve a form of advancement, earning a position as personal servant to Lysander's wife. He pressed something into Alexius's hand, a small piece of sharpened metal that could serve as either lockpick or blade. His meaning was clear without words. You have choices about how your story ends. That night, holding the crude weapon, Alexios contemplated his options. He could attempt escape, though success was virtually impossible, and failure would bring unimaginable torment. He could use it against his captors, achieving a moment of revenge before inevitable death. Or he could turn it on himself, choosing dignity over degradation in his final moments. But as dawn approached, he made a different choice. He hid the weapon where other slaves might find it, passing along the gift of options that Marcus had given him. His story might be ending, but others were still being written. Perhaps one of them would find a different conclusion. The journey to the mines took him through landscapes that sparked forgotten memories. Mountain paths reminded him of childhood adventures, streams where he had once caught fish with bare hands, villages that could have been his own. He didn't try to escape. The chains made flight impossible, but he used the journey to say goodbye to the world he was leaving. In the mining camp, surrounded by hundreds of slaves working in conditions that made household service seem luxurious, Alexios discovered something remarkable. Even here, in this final circle of suffering, The slaves had created their own society, their own forms of resistance and mutual aid. They shared stories of their lives before captivity, preserved languages and customs their captors had tried to eliminate, and bore witness to each other's humanity in ways their masters never could. The end came quietly, not with violence or drama, but with simple exhaustion. His damaged lungs finally surrendered to the constant assault of stone dust. His weakened body gave out after one tunnel collapsed too many. He died in darkness, surrounded by fellow slaves who promised to remember his name and carry his story forward. But this isn't really an ending, because stories like Alexius's echo through time, whispered in shadows where power prefers not to look. They remind us that behind every civilization has achievements, like countless unnamed victims whose suffering made those accomplishments possible. The classical world we admire gave us democracy and philosophy, but it was built on foundations of human misery so vast that it challenges comprehension. If we're honest, we must acknowledge that similar systems exist today, hidden by legal complexity and economic abstraction, but fundamentally unchanged. The powerful still exploit the powerless. Societies still build comfort on others' suffering, and the vulnerable still disappear into systems designed to consume them while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone else. The boy who died forgotten in that mountain mine represents thousands of voices silenced by those who found them inconvenient. His story reminds us that the price of civilization has always been paid by those who had no choice in the transaction, and that the beautiful marble halls of our own gleaming cities may still echo with cries we choose not to hear.